Family and friends of a teenager killed in West Palm Beach honoring her life tonight after police say Kelvi McCray was shot and killed by her ex-boyfriend. Hundreds of her friends and family came together on Singer Island. Our Joe Lopez was there as loved ones gathered tonight.
Family says that Kelvi loved the beach and the color purple, so what better way to honor her as they said their goodbyes.
Hundreds of friends.
We miss you, Kelvi.
And family.
She was everything to me.
Fought back tears.
It's gonna be tears of joy. We had a happy daughter.
As they filled the Riviera Beach Municipal Beach Park wearing Kelvi McCray's favorite color, purple and pink, a week after police say she was shot and killed by her ex-boyfriend, Keisean Shaw.
I hear the shots every day. I see her on the floor every day.
Marla McKinney is Kelvi's mom, who said she was home when her daughter was killed.
It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
She has found strength in love and support from those that knew her daughter.
This is her personality. And she was a people's person. Everyone loved her.
A love guided by candlelight down to the beach.
It means everything to me. It means everything to me, and I know it means everything to her too, in spirit.
Family and friends say that Kelvi and Shaw had broken up and that he wasn't taking it well. Family says that Shaw was on police's radar, but according to police, Shaw ended up shooting and killing Kelvi and then himself.
They let a guy that choked my daughter, put a gun to her head, get away.
They catch this guy the day before none of this happened.
West Palm Beach police says the day before the shooting, they were looking for Shaw and were even following him in his car, but he got away. Reporting on Singer Island, Joe Lopez, WPTV, News Channel 5.
A mother's scream pierces the night. A neighbor whispers, "I'll never forget what I saw." And somewhere, through the cracked audio of a FaceTime call, friends sit frozen, unable to process what just happened before their eyes. 18-year-old Kelvi had dreams that stretched further than the streets she grew up on. A future in nursing, a career in beauty and modeling, a life still unfolding. But in an instant, gunshots shattered it all. Police sirens painted the neighborhood red and blue. Crime scene tape fluttered in the wind, and the kind of horror you only expect to see on television became all too real. What makes this case so chilling isn't just the violence itself, but the timing. She had already spoken out, already reached for help, already tried to escape, and yet she ended up here. Her story is more than a tragedy. It's a warning. It's a riddle we have to unravel together. Why was Kelvi killed? And could it have been stopped before it ever began?
Welcome to Twisted Crimes Files, where the darkest truths come to light. Stay with us for chilling stories you won't forget, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a case.
West Palm Beach, Florida, a city caught between beaches, palm trees, and a violent undercurrent that too often makes the news. In 2024 alone, dozens of domestic violence cases were logged here. Stories of broken relationships, silenced victims, and families left behind. Amid those statistics stood Kelvi McCray, just 18 years old, a teenager with the polished ambition of someone twice her age. She was more than a name. She was a beautician with a loyal client base, a model with thousands of followers online, and a young woman preparing to step into a nursing career. Her face was one you'd recognize instantly from Instagram. Smiling, stylish, alive with possibility. But behind those photos, the reality of her final days reveals a question that still hangs in the air. How does a young woman go from planning her future to becoming the victim of a murder-suicide at the hands of someone she once trusted? Police reports would later confirm the most chilling detail. Kelvi wasn't a stranger to her killer. She wasn't caught in some random act of violence. Her murderer was her ex-boyfriend, 19-year-old Keisean Shaw, a young man she had already tried to walk away from. He had been charged with strangling her, holding her against her will, and pointing a gun at her just one day before her death. And yet, there she was, unprotected, unguarded, and exposed to the danger everyone thought she'd escaped. The crime shocked not just a neighborhood, but an entire state. Because the truth behind her murder forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Red flags were raised. The system had warning. And still, it ended with a teenager's funeral. As we step into this story, remember this. Kelvi was not just a victim. She was a daughter, a niece, a best friend, and a young woman with everything to lose. Her life demands more than sympathy. It demands answers. Before her name became a headline, Kelvi McCray was a daughter of Florida soil, raised in a family that believed in hard work, ambition, and faith. She was born in 2005, a child of the digital generation. By the time most teens were struggling to decide who they wanted to be, Kelvi was already mapping out her path. Family members describe her as someone who moved with purpose, intelligent, determined, and far older in wisdom than her years suggested. Her mother, Marla McKinney, remembers her as outspoken, yet warm-hearted, a young woman who could turn heads with her beauty, but win people over with her kindness. Friends say she had a laugh that carried through a room, and a work ethic that made even her mentors stop and take notice. Kelvi was an entrepreneur in the making. She didn't just style hair, she built a reputation. On Instagram, her beauty tutorials and candid snapshots earned her followers, clients, and the beginnings of what could have been a business empire. The hashtags under her posts weren't just vanity. They were the markings of a teenager who was already branding herself, thinking ahead, and setting goals. But Kelvi's ambitions didn't stop there. She dreamed of becoming a nurse, a profession built on compassion, resilience, and care. It's what made her more than an influencer or a model. She wanted to heal. She wanted to give back. Her uncle, Ricky Aiken, put simply, Kelvi was a go-getter. She had an entrepreneurial spirit. She was as beautiful as she was smart. Those closest to her called her Kel, a nickname that reflected her down-to-earth side. She could wear heels and makeup in front of the camera, but at home, she was just as comfortable in sweatpants, joking with her cousins, scrolling TikTok, or helping a friend get ready for prom. Her story wasn't just one of glamour. It was one of relatability. Kelvi represented every young woman who juggles dreams, responsibilities, and the search for love. Kelvi's background makes her tragedy unbearable, because once you understand how much promise she carried, the question becomes even sharper. How does a young woman with everything to live for end up face-to-face with the very person who refused to let her go? Like so many young love stories, it started innocently. Kelvi was just 16 when she first crossed paths with Keisean Shaw. He was only a year older, 19 at the time of her death, but their connection sparked quickly. Friends remember the photos they shared online, smiling selfies, hearts in the captions, little inside jokes that made it look like the start of something sweet. At first, he seemed like the supportive boyfriend. He commented on her beauty posts, tagged her in songs, and played the role of someone who wanted to be part of her future. For Kelvi, who was balancing school, entrepreneurship, and her nursing ambitions, Shaw was a companion who filled in the emotional spaces that her busy life left behind. But beneath that teenage romance was a harsher reality. Shaw didn't have the same stability Kelvi did. According to affidavits later uncovered by police, he often struggled with housing. At one point, Kelvi even allowed him to live with her, not because the relationship demanded it, but because she saw someone in need and tried to help. That generosity became her vulnerability. Over time, the love story began to sour. Shaw's affection hardened into control. Friends noticed the way he'd check her phone, the jealousy in his tone, the need to know where she was and who she was with. It wasn't just love, it was possession. Kelvi began to feel the shift. She told police, and she confided in her circle. Shaw did not accept the breakup when she finally ended things. He begged. He pressured. He insisted that they belonged together. And when persuasion failed, threats replaced promises. This is where her story changes from ordinary to terrifying. Because too many women know what it feels like to love someone who slowly becomes unrecognizable. The hand that once held yours becomes the hand that grips your throat. Kelvi's kindness, her choice to give him shelter when he had nowhere else to go, was the very decision that tethered her to danger. And once she found the strength to say no more, Shaw wasn't willing to let her go. The stage was set for a confrontation that would escalate beyond anything her family or friends could have imagined. March 6, 2024. For Kelvi, The day began like so many others. The Florida sun poured through her blinds, and she moved through her morning with the routine of someone who still believed she had time. She scrolled through her phone, liking a few posts, responded to messages from friends. There was no hint in her smiley replies that this day would be her last. By late morning, Kelvi texted with a friend about dinner plans. She wanted to cook at home, a quiet evening after the tension of the day before. Despite everything she'd endured, the threats, the violence, she was trying to hold onto a sense of normalcy, to steady herself with routine. Her mother later recalled how Kelvi's voice sounded tired, but hopeful. She had plans. She was ready to put the chaos behind her. In the afternoon, she took calls, scrolled through her business page, and chatted with cousins. But as the hours ticked by, those close to her sensed something beneath the surface. Her responses came slower. Some messages went unread. Others left undelivered. By early evening, Kelvi set the table for dinner. A FaceTime call buzzed through. 3 of her friends, laughing and catching up. She answered, propping her phone nearby as she sat down to eat. The sound of her laughter filled the space, and for a brief moment, it felt like any other night. But behind that call, another presence lingered. The friends on the screen saw it first. Movement, shadows, a figure stepping into frame. It was Shaw. Kelvi's voice faltered. The conversation froze. What began as an ordinary dinner turned into a moment that would leave her friends scarred for life. The hours of March 6th had narrowed into a single flashpoint. A young woman on FaceTime, a gun raised just feet away, and witnesses powerless to do anything but watch. The timeline of that day didn't end with laughter. It ended with police sirens and shattered lives. And what investigators walked into next would etch itself into the memory of an entire community. The first call came in at 9:45 p.m. Neighbors reported the sound of rapid cracks. Not fireworks, not a car backfiring, but the unmistakable snap of gunfire. Moments later, the flashing red and blue of West Palm Beach patrol cars cut through the night. Officers approached cautiously, weapons drawn, the silence of the street broken only by the rush of radios crackling. Multiple shots fired. Possible victims inside. When the door was forced open, the scene was nothing short of devastating. Inside the modest home, evidence of chaos lay scattered. An overturned chair, a half-eaten dinner plate on the table, a cell phone still glowing with an active FaceTime connection. On the other side of that call, her friends were hysterical, shouting, crying, frozen in shock at what they had just witnessed live. And then came the most unbearable sight. Kelvi McCray collapsed on the floor, her body marked by the violence she had endured. Gunshot wounds to the head, neck, and back. She wasn't breathing. Her pulse was faint, slipping away. Just a few feet away, officers found Keisean Shaw. He was slumped against the wall, a gun on the floor beside him, a single bullet wound to his head. He was still alive, barely, his shallow breaths gurgling in the heavy silence of the room. Paramedics rushed in. Their hands moved quickly, pressing, stabilizing, lifting. But the reality was clear. Both lives were hanging in the balance, one already too far gone. At the hospital, doctors confirmed what friends had feared. Kelvi had succumbed to her injuries within 30 minutes of the shooting. The girl who dreamed of nursing school would never take her first class, never post another smiling picture, never hug her mother again. Shaw, clinging to life, was officially charged with first-degree murder while still in critical condition. But less than 24 hours later, he too was pronounced dead. What began as an arrest ended as a murder-suicide. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines called her a model, an influencer, a rising star. But to those who knew her, she was simply Kelvi, a daughter who had begged for help the day before and was still failed by the system. The discovery of Kelvi's body was not just the end of her story. It was the beginning of questions no one could ignore. And those questions would drive investigators, the community, and her grieving family into a desperate search for answers. The crime scene was barely cleared before detectives from the West Palm Beach Police Department began pulling every string of the case. Forensics photographed the living room, the overturned chair, the dinner table still set. Kelvi's cell phone lying inches from where she collapsed. The screen cracked from the fall, but still faintly lit with missed FaceTime notifications. The walls bore the scars of gunfire, small jagged holes that would later confirm the number of shots fired. The handgun, a semi-automatic pistol, was recovered on the floor near Shaw's outstretched hand. The slide was locked back, a spent casing lodged inside. Gunpowder residue stained his skin. To investigators, the evidence spoke instantly. This was not a mystery intruder or a robbery. This was intimate, deliberate, and personal. But the real story wasn't in the room that night. It was in the paperwork filed the day before. Detectives sifted through reports from March 5th, less than 24 hours earlier, when Kelvi herself had called for help. The affidavit from that day painted a chilling picture. Shaw had allegedly wrapped his hands around her neck, squeezed until she struggled to breathe, pressed a gun to her temple, and whispered threats that froze her in place. He had barricaded her in, refusing to let her leave. When she finally broke free, sprinting toward her car, he flung himself onto the hood, his fists smashing into the windshield until it shattered in a spray of glass. Neighbors would later recall the sound of her screams echoing down the street. Responding officers documented her injuries, the redness along her neck, the trembling in her voice, the fear written across her face. They wrote up charges that were anything but minor: false imprisonment, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and battery. A warrant was issued for his arrest. Detectives now studying the timeline questioned why Shaw was still free. A short pursuit had been attempted, but officers called it off in the name of public safety. By the following evening, that decision would prove fatal. The investigation combed through eyewitness testimony. The three friends who had been on FaceTime that night became critical witnesses. They described the ordinary laughter of the call, the way Kelvi's voice suddenly shifted when Shaw appeared. They remembered her eyes widening, her body tensing, and then the deafening cracks that forced them to cover their mouths in disbelief. One friend told detectives, "We couldn't stop it. We just watched. We watched her die through the phone." That testimony was later reinforced during a photo lineup, when the witnesses pointed without hesitation to Shaw's face. There was no doubt. Detectives pursued theories of motive, but each path led to the same destination: obsession, jealousy, and control. Shaw had lost the relationship, lost his place in Kelvi's life, and faced the reality of being cut off from the one person who had offered him shelter. Instead of letting go, he chose to destroy the very person who had given him everything. Experts called in during the investigation noted the clear pattern of escalation: strangulation, often a precursor to homicide; a gun to the head, a lethal threat ignored; false imprisonment, the first step in complete control. Each sign was there, and each sign was missed. The detectives closed their files knowing exactly who pulled the trigger, but their work left them haunted by a bigger question: was this truly unavoidable? Because while the criminal investigation ended with a murder-suicide ruling, the theories about prevention remained open wounds. Could Kelvi have been relocated to safety? Could Shaw have been arrested and held after the violent assault? Could her life have been spared if the system had responded differently in that critical 24 hours? These weren't just questions on paper. They became the cries of a grieving family who demanded to know why the warnings were not enough. When news of Kelvi's death reached her family, it shattered more than hearts. It tore a hole through generations. Her mother, Marla McKinney, remembers the exact moment officers knocked at her door. Their words were professional, clipped, as if rehearsed for tragedies just like this. But no amount of training could soften the sound of, "Your daughter has been killed." Marla collapsed. Her cries were so piercing that neighbors came outside, unsure if the sound was human or something beyond it. Days later, she would tell reporters, "I feel like my daughter called the wrong number. She begged for help, and look where we are." Her uncle, Ricky Aiken, stood before cameras at the vigil. His voice broke with each syllable. He tried to speak of her ambition, her brilliance, her beauty, but tears blurred the words. He described her as a go-getter, a teenager with an entrepreneurial spirit, someone who wanted to build businesses and heal people at the same time. To him, Kelvi wasn't just a niece. She was proof of what the next generation could become. Losing her wasn't just personal. It was a theft from the future. The vigil itself was a sight that gripped the entire community. Along the sands of Riviera Beach, hundreds gathered with candles in hand. Pink and purple ribbons fluttered in the ocean breeze, Kelvi's favorite colors. Friends laid photos of her against lanterns, each one a frozen moment of her laughter, her joy, her life. As the sun set, the crowd began to chant her name. Soft at first, then rising, voices trembling under the weight of grief. Kel 6, Kel 6, Kel 6. Mothers clutched their daughters tighter. Fathers pulled their children close. It wasn't just mourning. It was a warning, a reminder that no one is immune. Her friends spoke too. One by one, they stepped forward, voices cracking, telling the world who Kelvi really was. A friend recalled how Kelvi stayed up late, helping her pick the perfect hairstyle for prom. Another remembered the way Kelvi always said, "I'll figure it out," no matter how impossible things seemed. Her cousin described her as someone who lit up rooms, who made people laugh until their sides hurt. And then, with a whisper, she added, "I don't know how to live in a world where her laugh is gone." The family's grief transformed into anger, and then into determination. They demanded answers from the city. They wanted to know why. After her desperate call for help the day before, she was left vulnerable enough to be killed. They retained attorneys, filed records requests, and vowed to hold the system accountable. But for all the legal language, for all the public statements, what echoed loudest was the raw human pain of a family who had lost their light. On social media, tributes poured in. Photos of Kelvi filled timelines, hashtags carrying her name across platforms. Hashtag Justice for Kelvi, hashtag Her Life Mattered. Each post was both a tribute and a protest, as if the digital world itself refused to let her memory be buried quietly. The family's voice made the case more than a police file. It made it human. It made it unforgettable. In the weeks after Kelvi's death, the tragedy refused to fade from the headlines. For her family, grief quickly sharpened into a single, unrelenting question. Why wasn't she protected? Her mother and attorneys held press conferences, standing before microphones with tears streaked across her face, demanding transparency from the West Palm Beach Police Department. She wanted answers. Why hadn't her daughter been moved to a safe location after reporting such violent threats? Why was Shaw still walking free, able to return less than a day later and take her life? She called for help, Marla said. She was brave enough to speak up, and still, she ended up in a morgue. What else was she supposed to do? The family's legal team filed public records requests, seeking every 911 transcript, every police log, every piece of communication that documented those last critical 24 hours. Their intent was clear. If the city would not hold itself accountable, then they would take it to court. A claim was filed against the city, with promises of a lawsuit if the answers didn't come. The community rallied. Vigils turned into marches. Friends and neighbors carried posters with Kelvi's face printed on them, photos of her smiling, captioned with phrases like "she deserved better" and "justice for Kelvi." Advocates for domestic violence survivors seized the moment to highlight a wider epidemic. Local organizations distributed flyers about warning signs: isolation, jealousy, threats, strangulation, each one a marker Kelvi herself had already endured. Experts reminded the public that strangulation is one of the clearest predictors of future homicide, a warning that, in her case, had gone tragically unheeded. The case also collided with a broader shift happening across Florida. Just weeks later, the state passed new legislation requiring law enforcement to perform lethality assessments in domestic violence calls. Structured checklists designed to identify victims in the most immediate danger and link them to shelters or advocacy programs. For many, the law felt like too little, too late. For Kelvi's family, it was a bitter reminder of what might have been. In neighborhoods across West Palm Beach, parents looked at their daughters differently. Friends checked in on one another more urgently. And families sat down to have conversations they had been putting off about controlling partners, about safety plans, about the thin line between love and danger. Kelvi's story became a mirror. For some, it reflected their own experiences with abuse. For others, it was a warning about what could happen if signs were ignored. But above all, it was a call, not just for justice, but for change. 18 years. That was all the time Kelvi McCray was given. She should have had decades. Decades to chase her nursing career, to build her business, to laugh with friends, to hold her mother close, to maybe one day walk down an aisle in her favorite shade of purple. Instead, her life was reduced to a case file stamped murder-suicide. The final image her friends saw of her wasn't a graduation cap or a wedding dress. It was a terrified young woman staring into a phone screen, realizing that the person she once loved had come to take everything away. Her story forces us to confront questions that should never have to be asked. How many warnings does it take before a victim is believed? How many cries for help have to be made before protection is offered? And how many more young women will have to die before change isn't just a law passed after the fact, but a system that works when it's needed most? For her family, the pain never ends. Her mother will forever remember the knock on the door, the words that froze her heart. Her uncle will never stop talking about the niece who was as beautiful as she was smart. And her cousins, her friends, her community, they will carry the silence of her absence in every holiday, every milestone, every room she should have been in. If Kelvi's story shakes you, it should. Because right now, somewhere, another young woman is begging for help and may not get it in time. Subscribe to keep these stories alive, to make sure no one forgets them. And if you refuse, then step into the comments and tell us why. Tell us why her life, her memory, her voice wasn't worth your attention. Because silence doesn't protect anyone. Silence only ensures the next victim is already lost. Kelvi's life ended too soon, but her story does not have to. It can serve as a warning, a call, a reminder. For Kelvi, for her family, for every victim silenced by love turned violent, someone must speak up.